The day the mirror didn't recognize me was the day something inside me stopped pretending it was still whole. I stood in front of it without hurry, without vanity, without any intention of checking my appearance, and felt a deep sense of estrangement that had nothing to do with age, exhaustion, or the marks of time, but everything to do with identity. Who was that woman reflected there, with eyes that seemed to apologize for existing, with a body present and a story missing? At what point did I stop seeing myself in order to continue being accepted? That question didn't come as curiosity. It came as rupture, like a thread pulled from the inside out, the kind that, once torn, takes with it every illusion of normalcy we built just to survive. I didn't look different on the outside. The shock was internal. It was realizing that the image no longer carried the woman I had been, nor the woman I once dreamed of becoming. The mirror only confirmed something I had been avoiding for a long time. I had been erased little by little, in silence, inside the very place where I tried hardest to belong. There was no major conflict, no cruel sentence spoken out loud, no explicit break. There was routine. There was adaptation. There were daily concessions. And that's how my identity began to fracture without anyone noticing. Not even me. Maybe you're listening to me now and feeling that same hard-to-explain discomfort, that sensation of looking at yourself and not fully recognizing who you are, as if something had been taken without warning. This doesn't happen all at once. It happens when you start shaping yourself too much to fit, when you learn not to contradict, not to disturb, not to take up too much space, when you keep adjusting your language, your gestures, your dreams, until one day the mirror gives you back an image that's correct, functional, but strangely empty. And that's when the question arises, even if you try to silence it, where did I go? I remember exactly how heavy that moment felt, because it didn't bring immediate answers. It brought awareness, and awareness hurts. It hurts because you can't unsee it. It hurts because it forces you to recognize that the erasure wasn't an isolated accident. It was a process made of small internal withdrawals, swallowed silences, versions of myself left behind to keep harmony, to avoid conflict, to not be seen as difficult. I learned how to be acceptable, and in that learning, I became less and less recognizable to myself. The mirror doesn't lie, but it doesn't accuse either. It simply reflects what remains after everything that was demanded of you. And that day, it reflected a woman tired of explaining herself without being heard, tired of holding up other people's expectations while her own needs were treated as exaggeration. It reflected someone who fulfilled roles perfectly, but no longer felt alive inside them. And realizing this wasn't an attack on my family, it was an awakening. Because when the mirror doesn't recognize you, it's a sign of emotional erasure, not aging. If this story is already touching you, before moving on, write in the comments where you're listening from. Your city, your state, your country. Not because place defines pain, but because this experience crosses women everywhere, in different cultures, in different families, with the same silent feeling of having been forgotten inside their own story. When you write where you're from, you affirm that you exist, that you take up space, that this narrative passes through you, too. What struck me most wasn't the image itself, but the late recognition that I had been reduced for years, reduced to functions, to labels, to family expectations that couldn't hold who I really was. And when that happens inside the family, the pain cuts deeper, because it's not just external rejection, it's internal displacement. It's realizing that to be accepted, you had to shrink essential parts of yourself. And no one warns you when that starts. No one tells you it will hurt later. You only find out once you're lost. Maybe you also learned early on that love requires sacrifice, that belonging requires adaptation, that being a good daughter, a good woman, a good presence meant not questioning too much. And so, without noticing, you became smaller inside spaces that were supposed to be yours. You learned to smile when you wanted to cry, to agree when you wanted to take a stand, to stay silent when something hurt. Until one day, the mirror becomes a stranger, because it no longer finds coherence between what you feel and how you live. That moment doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives on an ordinary day, in an unexpected pause, in a gaze that lingers longer than usual. And when it comes, you can't push it aside anymore, because the estrangement isn't superficial, it's existential. It asks about identity, belonging, the price of being who they expected you to be. And these questions don't ask for quick answers. They ask for courage to keep looking, even when you want to turn away. I began to understand that the mirror didn't recognize me because, at some point, I had stopped recognizing myself. I had outsourced my emotional image to other people's eyes. I started seeing myself through what they expected, what they approved of, what they tolerated. And when that happens, you can be surrounded by people and still live in internal loneliness, a strange loneliness, because no one sees it from the outside, but you feel it every day. If you've ever felt like you were living an edited version of yourself, write the word erased in the comments. Not as victimhood, but as naming. Naming what happened is the first step toward recovering what was silenced, because as long as you call it a phase, exhaustion, or confusion, the erasure keeps operating without resistance. The mirror only revealed what was already happening in my family dynamics. I was no longer seen as a whole individual, but as a function, as a predictable presence, as someone who was there to maintain balance, not to be deeply recognized. And when you realize that, something begins to move inside you, even if you don't yet know where to go. Awareness starts creating cracks in structures that once felt too solid to question. This story doesn't begin with the mirror. It began long before, in the small moments when you chose not to be yourself in order to keep belonging. On the days you swallowed yourself to avoid tension. On the times your emotions were minimized and you decided to believe you were overreacting. The mirror was just the messenger. And messengers don't invent truths. They deliver them when they can no longer be ignored. If something inside you already recognizes itself in this opening, stay with me. What the mirror revealed wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a deeper awareness about identity, family, and the cost of erasing yourself to fit. And once this understanding awakens, it doesn't go back to where it was before. It keeps asking for space, for voice, for us to look honestly at everything that was left behind in the name of belonging. The feeling of disappearing didn't start the moment I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself. It wasn't the reflection that brought the truth, but the emptiness I felt even before facing that mirror. The erasure, somehow, had already been underway long before I noticed. It begins in small gestures, in silent absences, in moments when you're no longer called the way you once were, nor recognized with the same intensity. The first sensation isn't physical loss, but seeing yourself reflected less and less in the relationships around you. It's as if, without warning, you begin to vanish in other people's eyes, until one day, when you look in the mirror, you no longer find the same image. And it was there, in front of that mirror, that everything I had been ignoring became impossible to deny. It wasn't about a flaw in the mirror, but about what was happening in my life. I was no longer called the way I used to be. I no longer occupied the same space in conversations, in decisions, in memories. The mirror didn't confuse me. It showed me a reflection of something I had felt for a long time but didn't want to admit. I was being erased, not brutally, but silently, gradually, as if little by little I had been turned into a shadow of who I once was. The mirror didn't lie. It revealed what I already knew. The image was fading before the name was forgotten, and it was then that I began to reflect on how the relationships in my life were functioning, how I was gradually taken out of the center and placed around the edges, observing but not influencing, present but not truly seen. How my family's dynamics slowly turned me into a background character, an acceptable presence, but not an essential one. Someone who was always there, but whose opinions, emotions, and presence were, at best, secondary. And this didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a single event, but a silent, invisible construction. I became less and less part of decisions, less and less remembered in conversations. I learned to be strong in silence, to not disturb, to not demand what should have been natural, to be seen, to be recognized, to be respected. I accepted that role without realizing it, until the mirror made me see that, at some point, I had lost myself in the idea of being a comfortable presence, someone everyone could rely on, but no one truly saw anymore. The pain wasn't just invisibility. It was realizing that as I began to disappear, the demands, expectations, and pressure to be present, functional, and responsible only increased. My family demanded presence, but didn't offer recognition. They wanted me there when they needed me, but never asked if I was okay, if I had space, if I also needed care. I was being led, without anyone noticing, to a place where my value was measured by my usefulness to others, not by who I was as a person. This happened so subtly, yet so constantly, that it became part of my daily life. I was present, but never the protagonist. There was no space left for what I wanted or felt. What mattered was that I fulfilled my role, that I supported, helped, fixed things. My individuality, my limits, my needs were set aside in the name of a harmony that never truly included me. And in return, I lived in a silent reality where the pain of being forgotten accumulated day after day, unseen. While everyone around me had a voice, I had been reduced to constant silence, a shadow of my own needs. I accepted that silence for a long time, because in my mind, being understanding and available meant being a good person. And so I drifted further and further away from who I really was, all in the name of keeping peace within the family. When you adapt too much, you start believing it's right, that you must erase yourself to avoid problems. But the truth is that excessive adaptation leads to deep emotional exhaustion. You lose yourself while trying to fit into what others expect, and each time you adapt more, you fade more, until one day, you no longer know what you truly want, what you truly feel, or even who you truly are. This dynamic of emotional self-erasure doesn't come from malice. It wasn't that my family didn't love or respect me. They simply no longer knew how to see me differently. I became a functional piece in the family system, someone who didn't ask for much, didn't cause trouble, was always willing to help, but slowly lost importance as I became predictable, controllable, and without a real place in decisions. Without anyone realizing it, this led me into emotional invisibility. I was always there, but never truly seen. The pain isn't only in the lack of recognition, but in the constant expectation that I be endlessly available while my own needs were ignored. What was demanded of me wasn't active, recognized presence, but self-erasure to maintain harmony. I was taught to be the one who yields, adapts, doesn't cause problems, the one who accepts being in the background. And for a long time, I did that, hoping that one day things would change, that people would finally see me, recognize me, give me the place I deserved. But I ignored one fundamental truth. Change never comes from the one who adapts too much. Change comes from the one who has the courage to take their place, to stand firm, to say no when necessary. I began to realize that my adaptation was no longer a choice. It had become a reflection of how my identity was being ignored. I was becoming a shadow of myself, fulfilling expectations without receiving anything in return. And it was in that moment, when the mirror returned, an image I no longer recognized, that the truth became impossible to ignore. I was being erased, and that erasure wasn't coming only from the outside, it was coming from within. I was fading myself to avoid discomfort, to avoid asking for more than I was given, until all that remained was the emptiness of what I had stopped being. If you recognize yourself in this process of adapting too much, of always putting yourself second, write the word erased in the comments, not as victimhood, but as a step towards self-awareness. Because when you start seeing what was set aside, you also begin to understand what needs to be reclaimed. That recognition isn't easy, but it's essential. From it, you begin rebuilding what was erased, neglected, forgotten. I can no longer allow myself to live in relationships where my presence only matters when it's convenient for others. I need more than that. I need to be seen, recognized, respected. I am no longer the person who disappears to keep the peace. I am the woman who deserves to be heard, valued, and loved for who she is, not just for what she offers. And in realizing this, I began to reposition myself, not through an external revolution, but through an internal movement. I stopped accepting invisibility from others and started seeing myself again. There was a time when I had to disappear to keep belonging. It wasn't a conscious decision. It wasn't planned. It was a silent learning, the kind that installs itself without asking permission. I learned very early that to remain part of the group, I needed to shrink. Shrink my voice, my presence, my desires, even my reactions. Belonging came to mean yielding, staying quiet, shaping who I was into what was expected of me. And this didn't happen all at once. It happened gradually, through small daily concessions that seemed harmless, but together began dissolving my identity without me noticing. I came to understand, without anyone explicitly saying it, that some versions of me were more accepted than others. The version that questioned was inconvenient. The version that felt deeply was too much. The version that set boundaries was difficult. So I kept the version that fit, the version that fixed things, the version that understood, the version that endured. Because that version was welcomed, that version was praised, that version kept the family system running smoothly. And for a long time, I confused acceptance with love. I confused belonging with emotional survival. In that context, belonging didn't mean being fully seen. It meant not disrupting, not destabilizing, not bringing up truths no one wanted to face. And I became very good at that, at feeling and not saying, at noticing and not pointing out, at molding myself so I wouldn't lose my place. But there's a high price when you have to disappear to be accepted. The price is yourself. Each time you shrink, a part of you is left behind. And there comes a moment when you no longer know where you got lost, you only know you're not whole. Maybe this part of the story is touching you because, on some level, you also learned that to belong, you had to erase yourself. Maybe you grew up believing love came with silent sacrifice, that to remain a daughter, a sister, part of the family, you had to swallow discomfort, normalize absence, accept constant correction about who you were. If that resonates, write, "I erased myself," in the comments. Not as blame, but as recognition. Recognition is the first step to understanding what was lost along the way. I realized that for a long time, I shaped myself to fit expectations that were never negotiated with me. I simply adjusted my tone, my posture, my dreams, even the way I felt. Because feeling too much was a problem, questioning too much was a problem, existing too much was a problem. So I became less intense, less visible, less whole. And that kind of exhaustion doesn't show up in the body right away, but it eats away from the inside, creating a hollow that's hard to explain. What hurts most is that this disappearance is often praised. They call it maturity, strength, resilience. They say you're the one who handles everything, fixes everything, is always there. But no one asks the cost. No one asks what you had to silence to be that person. No one asks who you stopped being to keep that role. And so the system stays comfortable while you slowly disappear, believing that's the price of family love. Belonging should never require you to disappear. But when we grow up in environments where affection is conditional, we learn that being fully ourselves is risky. So we choose adaptation, silence, emotional survival. And only much later does the realization hit. It wasn't belonging, it was containment. It wasn't full love, it was conditional acceptance. And understanding this hurts because it dismantles narratives that held years of our lives together. That's when another feeling emerged strongly. Grief. A different kind of grief, silent and deep. Grief for who I was and was never allowed to stay. The pain wasn't only for what happened to me, but for the version of me that had to be left behind so I could remain. I began to miss who I was before I learned to stay quiet, before I learned to mold myself, before I learned that loving meant shrinking. And that longing hurt more than any external conflict because it carried the awareness that I had participated in my own erasure. This grief has no ritual, no clear goodbye, no external recognition. No one says, "I'm sorry for the woman you had to silence." No one validates that loss, but it exists. It exists when you remember old dreams that never had space to grow, when you notice talents that were discouraged, when you feel a diffuse sadness without knowing exactly why. It's the grief for the original version of yourself that was corrected, adjusted, restrained to fit a system that couldn't tolerate your wholeness. I cried not only for what I lived through, but for what I couldn't live, for the spontaneity that was contained, for the joy that was moderated, for the truth that was swallowed. And those tears didn't come with rage. They came with a mature sadness, the kind that doesn't scream, but weighs heavy. Because I understood that to emotionally survive in that environment, I had to leave parts of myself outside. And now I was looking at those parts belatedly, trying to understand how to bring them back. If you feel you had to leave versions of yourself behind to keep belonging, write silent grief. Naming this grief matters, because when it's not recognized, it shows up in other ways: chronic exhaustion, emptiness, difficulty recognizing yourself, fear of taking up space. Grieving who you were isn't weakness. It's a sign that something precious was lost and needs to be processed. The hardest part of this grief is accepting that no one explicitly forced us. There was no direct order saying, "Don't be who you are." The system simply rewarded silence and punished authenticity. And seeking belonging, we learned quickly what worked. We stopped being ourselves to continue. And that doesn't make us guilty, but it does call us to responsibility. Now, because once awareness awakens, we can't pretend we don't know anymore. I began to understand that the woman I once was didn't disappear completely. She was silenced, not destroyed. She stayed hidden in deep layers, waiting for safety to reemerge. But for that to happen, I first had to acknowledge the loss. I had to honor who I was before I adapted. I had to allow myself to feel the sadness without minimizing it, because you can't build something new without honestly looking at what was sacrificed. This grief also brings guilt. Guilt for not protecting yourself sooner, for staying, for accepting. But that guilt needs to be met with compassion, because you did what you could with the emotional resources you had at the time. You did what seemed necessary to keep belonging. And that doesn't diminish you. It humanizes you. If you've ever blamed yourself for fading, write, "I survived." Surviving isn't failure, it's strategy. But there comes a point when surviving is no longer enough. You need to live. Grieving who I was also showed me something important. I no longer wanted to keep burying versions of myself to maintain bonds. I didn't want to pay that price anymore, because every time I tried to return to that old place of silence and adaptation, something in me resisted. Something had awakened. Something no longer accepted disappearing. And that something wasn't anger. It was self-respect being born, still fragile, but real. I began to see that honoring who I was meant not repeating the same pattern moving forward. It meant not automatically correcting myself to please, not silencing myself to keep the peace, not molding myself to be accepted. It meant allowing the woman I was and never got to be to finally exist, even if that caused discomfort, even if it required deep internal changes. If this part of the story is reaching you, write, "I want to be again." Being again isn't regression, it's reclamation, integration, allowing forgotten parts to find a safe place within you. And this process isn't fast or linear. It happens in layers, in small choices, in subtle boundaries, in quiet decisions that slowly rebuild your identity. This grief doesn't end here. It simply reveals itself. Because once you recognize who you had to leave behind, an unavoidable need arises. Understanding what to do with that awareness now, how to position yourself, how to protect yourself, how to rebuild without disappearing again. And it's from this point, this deep recognition of loss and fragmented identity, that the story moves toward an even more delicate layer involving mirrors, expectations, and how the gaze of others can erase us or return us to ourselves. The mirror took on a different role from that moment on. It stopped being just a daily object and became a silent witness to everything that had been happening to me over the years. Every time I stood in front of it, vanity wasn't what appeared, but estrangement. The reflection seemed weakened, as if something were missing, as if that image couldn't sustain who I truly was. And this didn't happen overnight. The mirror simply revealed the outcome of a long process of identity erosion that had been fed within my own family history. I realized that the more I adapted, the less I recognized myself. The more I stayed silent, the less firmness the reflection returned. The mirror doesn't lie. It reflects what's happening inside. And what it showed me wasn't just aging or physical exhaustion. It was erasure. The absence of an inner presence weakened by constant silence, concessions, and emotional renunciation. The mirror became a living archive of what was never said, never held, never recognized. Maybe you're listening now and feeling something similar. Maybe you've looked in the mirror and felt something didn't align, not because you disliked the image, but because the woman there seemed to have lost density, contour, place. If that resonates, write "I saw myself," because many women disappear inside their own stories without anyone noticing until the mirror starts exposing that quiet vanishing. The mirror witnesses when identity begins to erode. It sees when you start looking at yourself seeking approval instead of recognition, when you stop asking who you are and start asking who you need to be to keep belonging. It sees when your light dims, not from lack of strength, but from too much containment. And this kind of pain is very specific because it doesn't come from outside. It comes from the clash between who you were and who you had to become to emotionally survive in that environment. I began to understand that the mirror wasn't being cruel. It was being honest. It reflected the direct impact of living in relationships where I wasn't fully recognized, where my emotions were tolerated but not welcomed, where my presence was useful but not celebrated, where my value was conditioned on what I delivered, not who I was. And these dynamics leave deep marks. Because when there's no external recognition, we start doubting our internal reflection. Erasure doesn't happen abruptly. It's gradual. First, you stop being seen in small things. Then you stop being heard. Then you stop being considered. And when you realize it, you no longer recognize yourself. The mirror simply records what's already been happening inside. It doesn't create the pain. It reveals it. And revelation hurts, but it's necessary. Because while erasure isn't seen, it keeps operating freely. If you've ever felt like you disappeared inside your own family, write "I erased myself" here. That phrase carries a truth many women avoid naming, because admitting you erased yourself hurts, but staying erased hurts far more. In that sense, the mirror doesn't accuse, it invites awareness. It shows that something needs to be looked at more honestly. It was through this process that another understanding formed clearly. Those who don't recognize also don't sustain. Where there's no emotional recognition, there's no solid foundation for a healthy bond. There are demands, expectations, pressure, but no real care. I began to see that many of my pains came exactly from this imbalance. I was demanded of, but not recognized. They expected presence, availability, understanding, but there was no true gaze for who I was, for what I felt, for the limits I carried. Recognition isn't empty praise. Recognition is seeing the other as a subject, not a function. It's validating emotional experience. It's considering pain, individuality, history. When this doesn't exist, the relationship becomes fragile, even if it lasts years, because it's sustained by obligation, not genuine exchange. And that weighs heavy, because you start feeling responsible for maintaining something that never truly sustained you. I realized that where there was no recognition, there was always an attempt to shape me, correct me, adjust me, improve me, as if I were constantly in emotional debt, as if I needed to prove my worth all the time. And this kind of relationship is deeply exhausting, because there's never rest, never a safe place to be who you are, never a "you are enough," only a "you need to be this way." If you've ever felt constantly demanded of in environments where you were never truly seen, write "they only demand." This isn't victimhood, it's clear reading of dynamics. Where there's only demand, there's absence of recognition. And where there's no recognition, there's no emotional support. The bond may continue, but it becomes heavy, asymmetrical, draining. I began to understand that recognition is what grounds relationships. Without it, everything becomes obligation, weight, emotional debt, and no one can sustain that for long without becoming ill inside. When you're not recognized, your pain is minimized, your limits are seen as exaggeration, your exhaustion is ignored, and still, they expect you to keep giving the same as always. This was a major turning point in my awareness, because I realized it wasn't lack of effort on my part. I was over-efforting. The problem was structural, relational. The absence of recognition was eroding any possibility of healthy exchange, and this can't be fixed with more adaptation, more silence, or more attempts to please, because what's missing isn't delivery, it's gaze. Once again, the mirror was honest. It reflected not only who I was becoming, but the impact of living without recognition, a tired reflection. eyes searching for validation, a posture that no longer occupied space naturally. Seeing this was painful, but also liberating, because it removed from me the responsibility of trying to be recognized where there was no willingness to see. If this part of the story is touching you, right, they didn't see me. Not being seen hurts. It hurts because it wounds something basic. The human need to be recognized as who we are. Not as a role, not as a function, not as utility, but as a whole person. And when that doesn't happen, something in us retreats, protects itself, disappears. I began to realize that trying to sustain relationships without recognition is like trying to keep a house standing without a foundation. It might stand for a while, but any extra weight causes cracks, and I was full of internal cracks. Cracks no one else saw, but I felt every day. The mirror only confirmed what my body already knew. This understanding didn't bring immediate anger. It brought clarity. Clarity that continuing to explain myself wouldn't help. Continuing to wait wouldn't help. Continuing to try to be seen wouldn't help. Because recognition isn't begged for. It happens when there's emotional availability on the other side. And when there isn't, insisting only deepens the erasure. I was still processing all of this. Still trying to understand how to move forward without continuing to lose myself. Because noticing erasure is only the beginning. From there, something starts moving internally. A need to reposition, to protect, to recognize myself first, since others didn't. And this movement isn't simple or fast. It requires emotional courage to stop accepting relationships that survive on your absence from yourself. This part of the story doesn't close anything. It only expands awareness. It shows that the mirror doesn't lie, that where there's no recognition, there's no support. That erasure leaves visible marks for those willing to look. And it's from this clarity, this more honest gaze toward yourself, that something begins to reorganize internally, preparing the ground for the next movement, which involves choice, positioning, and the quiet decision not to keep erasing yourself, to maintain bonds that never truly knew how to see you whole. When I see myself, the mirror returns, not as before, not as a promise of external repair, but as the reflection of an internal repositioning no one can take from me. The mirror no longer needs my family's validation to exist, because now I sustain my own gaze. And this doesn't erase what was lived, doesn't rewrite the past, doesn't magically transform relationships. What changes is the axis. I stop existing from the absence of the other and start existing from my presence with myself. That's when the image returns, not because I was finally recognized, but because I stopped disappearing to belong. This movement isn't loud. It doesn't ask for applause, explanation, or permission. It happens when we stop waiting for someone to give back what only we can rebuild. When I see myself, I no longer depend on being seen. When I recognize myself, the mirror stops being accusation and becomes witness again. Witness to someone who doesn't beg for place, doesn't plead for affection, and no longer negotiates her own existence. Now on the screen, there's another video from the Matriarch Secrets waiting for you. It's another story, another theme, another layer of awareness. Not a continuation, but a new invitation to deeper seeing. Stay with me. Each video here is a new mirror, and not all of them reflect pain. Some reveal strength, clarity, and the woman who emerges when she finally decides to see herself.